You're listening to Kane, Randy, and Brooke on Scratch the Vinyl.
All right, everybody, welcome back to Scratch the Vinyl. You made it back for another week, and of course, we're pumped that you did. Welcome back to the show. Tonight, unfortunately, we don't have Brooke here. I think she's running for a local office or something.
That's what I heard. Yeah.
That's it. That's what we heard.
Yeah.
We do, in fact, have Richard in as our third host today. Richard, how you doing?
Amazing, Kane. Amazing. Owner of Broken Hearts.
That's right. We are the Broken Hearts Club together. And I'm glad to have you. You know, it started as a friendship in the show where you were kind of just like a guy listening, and then you contacted us. You became, a guy who came on the show, and now you're like our other member, man. Like I said, you're the Billy Preston of the group.
You betcha, man. It's my honor.
That's awesome.
And then we have the Godzilla of entertainment in Lincoln, the man, the myth, the legend, Randy Wilson. Welcome back to the show.
Welcome, guys. It's great to see everybody today. And of course, Richard, thanks for being in the studio. So we have an awesome guest on today, and we can't wait to get started.
We do have an awesome guest. We've really been knocking it out of the park lately, and this is going to be no different, everybody. So sit back, put your arms and legs in the vehicle, and don't let them out, or you might rip them off or something. So let's bring on our guest right now. He is a guy who has shaped the Lincoln scene. This is what we've been talking to you guys about. The Lincoln scene has been so great for so many years. And for those of you who are doubters, when you listen to this episode, you're going to realize that the Lincoln scene of music has been great for a long time. And this guy has a lot to do with it. He was in Four Against. He was in the Millions. He is a fantastic human being. Let's talk to him right now. Harry Dingman, how are you?
Doing good. Thanks for having me on.
Of course, man. I as a local musician here am pumped to talk to a guy like yourself, because I think that guys like you shaped the scene for us when I was in the 90s, early 2000s, picking up instruments for the first time and wanting to play out. I think that guys like you are the reason why people like us and our kids are now playing in the scene. So I think you had a huge part of it. So my first question to you is, because you were in Four Against, I know you were in the Millions, and I want to talk about them too.
Yeah, right.
But for the Millions, I mean, Richard was a fan back. I mean, Richard has never missed a show, I don't think, right?
Fanboy, total.
Right.
Yep.
So what was it like for you coming up in that scene? Because I know that Randy was kind of loosely a part of that scene, or maybe just missed your earliest days. What was it like coming up in those times?
That's a good question. We wanted to play places, and I was in this band called the Cartoon Pupils in high school, and it was before Four Against, and this is like in probably about 1981, 82, around that era. And we literally practiced on Taylor Park. We had a house. One of the drummer and the bass player lived in there with parents, and we had a sliding glass door, and we'd take the equipment out into the park and just set up and play. Some two little kids would come up and watch, and we were like, oh, this is pretty cool. And then we got asked to play like a keg party at East High. And, before that, we really didn't do that much. And it's like we show up in somebody's garage set up, and they're like, we told them we don't do covers. We play more of our original music. But a lot of East High people went, and they thought it was cool. And we, maybe played some Joy Division songs. And then we're getting asked to play all these parties. And then some of the other people from East High are like, hey, you guys could use a singer. And, we had a singer that kind of worked with us and then didn't. So we got Steve Canny to sing, and he knew a lot of people. So we're instantly popular and playing more places. Then the band, The Click, came to one of the parties, and they were like, you guys are great. Do you want to play with us at the Drumstick? And we were like, oh my God, this is the best thing ever, And I remember being up there playing. The stage was really loud. We got to use their equipment, and, we felt really good about that. So it was fun. I thought the Click were amazing, and just to share that stage with them was cool. So they were kind of like our idols. We wanted to be like them, not in sound, but just what they were doing. So
Well, we just talked to Kathy Lohmeyer from the Drumstick. She's part of the Lohmeyer family.
right,
As we're remembering the Drumstick, I'm going through posters, pictures, and flyers, and I see For Against in some of those, and I was just like, Randy and I talk about this all the time, and I know Randy's going to want to jump in here real quick. Is the full circle moments that we have on this show where we start talking to one person, and Lincoln's the biggest small town in the world, right? And so all the
right.
synchronicities and the universe aligning and all this starts to happen. And so you guys played at the Drumstick, and it was a legendary place. I mean, there's some massive bands that went through there, and I would say that you guys were part of that. But what was it like for you playing at the Drumstick? I mean, aside from it being too loud, when you think about it now.
That's a great question. Also, we saw REM there early on and stood out in the parking lot by the door. Michael Stipe came and stood by us. That was cool. And talked to Peter Buck. Then they all came to a party that some friends were having afterwards. So we got to hang out with them. So the Drumstick was a cool place. I was younger, so I really didn't get in the door that much. But we'd call Tim Lohmeyer up and ask if we could, play or open. We opened for like Lords of the New Church and 10,000 Maniacs. And all those shows were really cool. So we were influenced by those bands and, their equipment, what was going on. The Drumstick was an interesting place because we didn't necessarily like it, but it was a cool place to play. And, we didn't really make any money. It wasn't about the money. It was just having that cool experience. So
Speaking of sounds, I'm a fanboy of yours, and we're also friends, but you have unique tone. And if anybody's ever listened to your music, I mean, you're like, to me, you're like The Edge and, some of these great guitar players that have these tones. Where does that tone come from? I mean, did you develop that when you were in high school? I mean, it's you. I can hear that guitar and go, that's Harry Dingman.
oh, thanks. Yeah. Well, early on, there was a band called Holiday. Matt Rutledge, Britta Wheeler were in that band, Paul Englehart. And Matt was a really great guitarist. And I just basically looked at the pedals he had. Like, oh, he's got a compressor. What's that do? It doesn't seem to do anything, but I think I need one. And then things like that. We played with the 10,000 Maniacs, and they had a volume pedal. And that guy really used it for volume swells. And I'm like, went to a garage sale, and it was the same pedal, an Ernie Ball volume pedal. And then I used various amps. I had a Fender Quad Reverb at first, a super loud amp. I think I bought it for $50, and then I got a Roland Jazz Chorus because MTV was coming on at that time, and I saw like the Simple Minds playing, and that guy had a jazz chorus, so I bought one of those. I had 2 paper routes and washed dishes, so I had some money and could experiment and get pedals. And then the big thing was Jeff Running said, you should buy the Space Echo. There's a Space Echo for sale. It's a tape echo. And so I bought that. And that's probably the most creative, aspect of the gear that I owned or equipment, because it seemed to have a mind of its own. It would turn on and kind of make a wavering effect. And it was a lot of fun to use. And I still have it. And that's on basically all the albums. And you can hear it. So, and as far as guitar playing, the actual playing part, I would just sit around like the kitchen table and write picking parts. Like I just figured out, I took guitar lessons for a little while from this guy, Jonathan Swift. And he's like, look, you're never going to be Jimi Hendrix. You're never going to play like that. And I'm like, okay. He said, just be yourself. And then he went on tour, stopped guitar lessons, about to sell my guitar. And I just started, playing at home. And I remember thinking, this is cool. Like I'm just picking. So that's kind of that stylistic thing, is just figuring out like a bar chord, but I'm not barring the whole chord. I'm letting open strings ring. And so those open strings are real simple parts, but it just seemed to click. Like it's something I could do. So
You tailored that style to your abilities pretty much. And
right.
Yeah.
And I mean, a lot of people could play like Eddie Van Halen. There were a lot of really good guitar players at East High and at Leffler junior high, and I jammed with some of those people, but they could pull off Jimmy Page. And I had trouble struggling on the bass to play John Paul Jones's part. So I was like, I got to do something different. And then about that time I saw the Ramones in Omaha, and they were just so like their look, their giant amps, their sound, and the guy basically just played like power chords or bar chords, E-form bar chords the whole time, and it sounded awesome. The opening band was a band called like Scudder or something like that. And they tried to be new wave. They played like some B-52 songs, and they got booed off the stage. Technically, they're probably a better band, but the Ramones just had it going on. And I was like, that's how you do it.
That's what makes you a great teacher too, is that stuck with you, play to your abilities and your strengths. And I mean, I think you're a phenomenal guitar teacher. So
Oh, thanks. Yeah. Well, I've had to figure out the guitar and learn how to talk about it, learn notes and theory and stuff like that. So I actually can explain it better, read tablature. So when, back in the days of Four Against the Millions, a lot of times I didn't even know what notes I was playing. I mostly downstroked, just made up my own chords and it, had fun doing that. So.
Well, Harry, I'm going to jump in. I got to tell you, you talk about all these bands in this time period, and it like just takes me back to my junior high and high school days, and I really want to know a little bit, if you could tell us a little bit more about the music scene and other places you played around town in the in the 80s and stuff, and kind of how that kind of propelled how you kind of move forward in the music stuff.
Right, right. Well, early in the 70s, there were a lot of cover bands, and we had some family friends. They were in a band called the Grand Traverse Express and then the Star City Players. We would go and see them play. Even my parents would go, and they would let us sit backstage. So, or sit at the drums, play the bass guitar when they were setting up, things like that. So that had an influence. We thought, wow, they're really good. This is cool. We're hanging around a real band. There was actually like a garage band in my neighborhood called No Class, and they played at our elementary school. And, I think they only knew like 3 or 4 songs, and they couldn't make it through those songs. They couldn't get their guitars in tune. But I thought it was the coolest thing I'd ever seen. It was so loud and cool, and, a rock band at our school. So that was really early on. And then, going to Dirt Cheap and collecting records and going in on Tuesdays when the imports were there. That's how I met Jeff Runnings, and, Mark Schreiner, a bunch of people were down there. We'd trade records. We'd go over to the Dirt Cheap employees' houses, trade 7-inches or buy 7-inches, that sort of thing. And then we'd see flyers or see people, and we were like, look at that guy. He's dressed, I've never seen a guy with blue hair or spiky hair. It's pretty cool. And then we would see these flyers. So we showed up at a place on 27th and Randolph called the Party Room. And the first time I went, I think there was like a cover band, and people were, hanging out, but it wasn't that exciting. But then we went and saw some original bands like the Youngsters and the Click. I'm trying to think who else played that night, but it was just like a phenomenal show. And then Bruce Steven and Carl Steven, we went together to that show, and we were like, we have to form a band now. After seeing that show, it was really exciting. And the music was great, and it was creative. None of the bands sounded the same. It was kind of that post-punk era, so it wasn't really punk, and it really wasn't pop. It wasn't cover music like a lot of the popular bands were playing at that time. So that Party Room was cool. And then there were just other shows like the Capital Punishment shows, the Ordeal and stuff like that at abandoned buildings. So that's kind of how it all got started. And then there were more of the LA punk bands, and then they called us like a flop band because we had flops or longer hair. So
you gave a shout out to one of my old friends, Mark Schreiner.
Oh yeah.
So I hope he gets to catch one of the shows that you gave him a little shout out there. But yeah, that's kind of where I started kind of really getting into that music that you're talking about in that, late 80s, early 90s. And man, I look back on those days super fondly, because it was just like everything seemed new and different, and it just wasn't mainstream radio and covers. And
oh yeah.
And, we always got all that, but I always enjoyed like what you're talking about. I used to go to garage party bands all the time. That was our thing to do. And so,
Right. And it was all word of mouth, and it didn't matter if there were like 5 people or 50. It was just fun to hang out and talk to people and talk about music and whatnot. I think that Lincoln had a bunch of touring bands that came through too that played Pershing. I saw John Denver back in the day, Elton John, Johnny Cash. I actually saw him a few times, and those were really great shows. Those were all, with my parents, and it was fun. I just enjoyed music from an early age. Never really thought I would play it, but I think in high school it's like that'd be cool if I could write an original song or something. Then the whole punk thing came in, the drumstick, and that's when it all got rolling. And Jim Jones, the Capital Punishment, doing the fanzine, kind of keeping everybody together, and you'd get those fanzines. Then there was Dave Miley at KZUM, and basically we write a song, put it on cassette, go down there and say, "Will you please play this?" And he would.
So that's how Four Against was forged, was out of these parties. Tell us.
Well, and more of the meeting Jeff was more of a record store thing. He was always at the record store. And then we started going to Omaha together to buy records, so.
Okay. And then tell us a little bit about the history of that band.
Yeah, well, Four Against started out as Glue, and the Cartoon Pupils had just broken up, and Brian Hobbs, who later went on to be in Power of the Spoken Word, he had booked a show at the Party Room, and they also called it the Hall. And he was like, "Well, you guys, are you playing?" And I said, "No, we're not." And I said, "But I'll put together another band." I wasn't sure how I was going to do it. And I was taking the bus home from Dirt Cheap one day, and there was this girl on the bus, and she said, "Hey, I know you from grade school." It was Liz Panarelli. And she sat across from me, she's like, "Do you mind if I sit with you?" We started talking about music and what she was really into, the Talking Heads. And she also played in a reggae band called The Cost of Living. And she's like, "I can play bass with 4 fingers." And I said, "Well, let's get together and play." And I said, "I have a drummer, Greg Hill." And so we had a rehearsal space out on West O that we rented, that Matthew Sweet gave to us. And so we wrote like 5 songs in a practice. And I was like, "Who are we going to get to sing?" And then we got John Finbu of Hymn to Joy. That band had just broke up. And John came out and he said, "Yeah, I can sing to this," and immediately started writing lyrics. And then I was like, "Well, and by the way, on Saturday we have a show." And he was like, "No, we don't." And I said, "Just go with it." And so we did, and we played the show. And I mean, we got a great response. People really liked us. And we pulled off like 5 songs in about a week. So original songs. And then we went to Rick Morris and started recording and put out our own cassette called DBL. And then about that time, Jeff joined on keyboards. So Jeff Runnings, and Jeff then brought in some of his own songs and would also sing. And then sometimes Liz would play keyboards and Jeff would play bass. So that's kind of the beginnings of Four Against. And that was called Four Against One, DBL, Dumb Boring Lincoln, then Four Against One, because we were always arguing with Liz. We were kind of at odds. And then Liz, we were talking about moving to a different place. And Liz got kind of upset about that because she's like, "Oh, I really don't want to do that. I want to go to school." So she quit. And then we played maybe one show at the Drumstick with John. And then I don't think that he felt that was the direction he wanted to go. So he quit. And then I remember meeting at Village Inn with Jeff and Greg saying, "What are we going to do?" And then Jeff Runnings was like, "I'll buy a bass and I'll sing." And we were like, "Okay." And he's like, "If we suck, we can just quit." That was kind of Jeff, and so we got together, and I remember thinking, "This will suck," and we had a cool place to practice. We had an open basement that was completely open, and it was huge with high ceilings. It was just our equipment. So we got down there and started to play. And, I'd written a lot of these picking songs, more like pop, like music, more along the lines of REM. And we actually recorded some of those. But then this room was so loud and echoey, and things just kept getting louder. And I had that space echo, and I'd turn that thing on, or I had an old keyboard that I'd play. And just all that reverb and volume started to shape the Four Against sound. So again, we started to sound more like a darker post-punk band just out of our environment. I don't think it was like a conscious effort. And then we started to jam on the songs more. Instead of like bringing an idea in, we just start to play. There's a song called Aim and Eve that Jeff just started to play that keyboard line. And I came in with the guitar, Greg with the drums. And then we were like, let's record it. So like we hadn't even really planned it. There were no vocals. I just did my guitar lines and Jeff added his stuff. So that was kind of our formula to jam on these songs, sometimes bringing in a complete song to Four Against, like the song Daylight. I had the bass part, the guitar part, the lyrics, it was all done and I knew what I wanted on the drums. But most of the time it was jamming in that basement that shaped Four Against.
I really enjoyed like those first 3 albums. Like that was just a whole different, like we didn't hear stuff around here like that. And
right. I remember when we put out a 7-inch, the Autocrat, It's a Lie, and we played the Brickyard at that time, and there were so many people came to that show. I mean, we were used to getting, like, when we play bars, like 4 to 15 people at most. John Baker, Sue Sokol, Jeff Gaskins would always show up, Sean Mashew. There were some key people that would be at every show. And then we played that Brickyard show and it was, you couldn't even hardly get in the door. And I remember the audience pushed into us. Someone who fell into the monitor, sparks started to come out. Jeff kept getting hit in the face with his microphone because people were falling into it, that we just stopped. We didn't know what else to do. We couldn't even finish the show. So that was kind of like a turning point where people were like really getting into the music. And it was that self-released 7-inch. And then we got some gigs with Savage Republic. We did some tours with them. And we had sent out our cassette tapes. And I know Perry Farrell was calling us all the time from Jane's Addiction. And he was like, I love you guys. Let's do a tour. They were in a band called Psycom at that time. And we had a whole East Coast tour set up with Psycom. Then he called Jeff and he was like crying and said, that band broke up. I'm really sorry. The tour is canceled. And it was like 2 weeks out. So, and then we were friends with Dino Paredes. He was the first bass player of Jane's Addiction and in Psycom. And then I think he and Bruce Leisher at IPR started to get into those cassettes that we had sent and listening to them on the road when Savage Republic was on tour. We just recorded like a 4-track recording with a drum machine of Fate, the Purgatory Salesman, songs like that. And we gave that to them. And then they called and said, hey, this other deal fell through. Would you guys want to put out an album with us? And that's when Echelons came out, when we got into that.
You guys are actually nominated for a Grammy for that, correct?
Right. That was for the cover artwork. And, I think it was that letterpress design with the wheat that really attracted people's attention. But yeah, we got a lot of press for that. And, we were offered a big European tour. A lot of things we were actually, some people were like actually flying us to shows and stuff, which is fun. And we did like a tour of the East Coast, our own tour, and hooked up with Savage Republic and other bands along the way. So that was a fun time. Recording Echelons was an experience because we did it at a place called Master Tracks, and that was Tom Larson's studio. We were working with Dave Snyder and Randy Watson at that time, who did our 7-inch. And we didn't have a deal. We just went in there, booked time, started recording. And then once we got our deal, we could finish the album. We had some of the basic tracks done. But I remember that studio was big and had a nice live sound. I didn't do a lot of close miking with my amps. I would put the mics all over the room and get that space echo going. I remember on our 7-inch with Autocrat, we just had the chords and the picking. There was no feedback. So that all that texture of feedback was me going into the control room to listen to something, set my guitar still on by the amp, and it started to feed back. And then I was like, oh, let's put that, roll the tape. So it's, again, pretty spontaneous. And for some reason, it just fit the song perfectly. It's like I worked it out, but I really didn't. And we tried other things that weren't successful. And then there was an engineer called his name was Dan Tunges. He was the repair guy at Dietz. He said, I like your sound. Randy says you're great. I want to record you guys. So he got involved with Echelons. And I think about most of the album was recorded when he was there, but his technique was way different than most people at that time. He set all the amps up together. So everything bled, all the mics bled into each other. So Echelons had a bigger sound that way too. And that was, a technique that he brought to that sound. And I think Jeff borrowed a different, bigger bass. He always played Mustangs, and he borrowed like a hammer bass to get a different sound. So
obviously you had some impact on other bands in the area. And we've talked to quite a few people from that time frame, and they all bring you up.
Oh yeah. Well, we were kind of wondering what was going on, because again, we would play some shows and people would show up, and we'd play other ones and they didn't. Yet we went on tour, and we did really well on tour, but at the same time we were like, but do we even have a fan base in Lincoln? So I guess there were some people that were listening. Even like I've talked to some of my friends that were into skateboarding and stuff, and they were like, oh yeah, that December album, I played that all summer long. And I thought, wow, you were into that.
Oh, yeah, it's the best part of the day. It's the best part of the show. Not really. The whole show's pretty good, but I love this part. This is the part where we get to share our sponsors with you guys. We get to share the people, places, and things that keep this show going and give you guys podcast excellence, or at least we'd like to think so. So let's first off run the Elegant Sasquatch ad, and then when we get back, we'll do the local roundup where we talk about local bands, what they're doing, places to go, and all the great sponsors that we have. And then after that, we'll get back to it with our guest, Harry Dingman. Welcome to the Late Late Show with your host, Squatch.
Welcome to the show, everybody. We have a controversial guest tonight. He claims to have the world's smelliest beard and doesn't plan to do anything about it in the foreseeable future. Let's bring him on right now. He wants to be brought on by what he goes by on his socials, Toxic Beard 87.
Hey, calm down. Don't hate the smells of it sells.
Hello, my toxic friend. Let me ask you something. With brands like the Elegant Sasquatch Beard Company, why do you choose to smell like a rotten egg on Easter?
It all started when I was 16 years old. My beard was growing like a forest full of pine trees, and it was time for me to find a delicious scent to make Cindy Jo fall in love with me. I found a beard oil in a store, and I thought for sure she was going to be mine. I caked it on, and I was so proud of the way I smelled and how I looked. As soon as I saw Cindy Jo, I went running over to her, but instead of her embracing me and taking me in, she told me to go away and told me I smelled terrible. It was the worst day of my life. It was right then that I vowed that I would never put another product in my beard again. And so here I am, Toxic Beard Guy 87, and I'm not going anywhere.
Well, if I'd gone through that, it'd been tough for me to show my face again, too. But luckily, there's companies like the Elegant Sasquatch Beard Company that have multiple products that'll have girls like Cindy Jo melting in the palm of your hand.
Sasquatch, do you really think that there's a product for me?
Yes, my friend. There are beard balms, beard oils, beard butters, and beard washes that will make your whiskers the talk of the town. You'll be smelling like a dozen roses, and you'll be looking the best you've ever looked.
I would give anything to get Cindy Jo to talk to me just once again. Where can I get this amazing product?
Head on over to elegantsasquatchco.etsy.com and find yourself getting lost in the amount of items that they have to offer, including beard boxes as well, with the full line of some of their favorite products.
There's only one thing left to do. I'm going to go over to Etsy right now, and I'm going to buy as much product as I can, and I'm going to find Cindy Jo, and I'm going to win her over. Thanks again, Squatch.
You heard it here, folks. We changed his mind. Next on the show, we'll have a doll with an eating disorder. Then we'll have squirrels riding skateboards. Till then, head on over to Etsy right now. Tell them that the Scratch the Vinyl podcast sent you.
All right, let's dive into the local roundup right now. There's so much going on. I don't want to wait any longer to tell you. So let's go over to Gray's Keg. Friday night, they've got the Dill Pickles and the Dive Kings. That's going to be a heck of a show. The Zoo Bar Friday night for the early show, they've got the Scallywags. For the late show, they've got Parfait. And then on Saturday for the early show, they've got Mike Semrad and the Riverhawks. So you don't want to miss that. Those guys are fantastic. Then for the late show on Saturday at the Zoo Bar, our guest not too long ago, Lee Bowes and his band, the Jupiter Rings, are playing there. So get over there and see them. Tell them you listen to it right here on Scratch the Vinyl. You heard it here. Saturday night at Duffy's at 10 p.m. They've got a pretty massive show going on. It is a night of funk. They've got from Denver, Wild Love Tigress. They're a funky psych band. Sounds like a good time. Also, they've got the Groove Lagoon is out there, and Beyond Bananas. I've heard so many great things about both of those bands. I've got to go see them soon. A night of funk. Get functified. Get out there. Sounds like a blast. Looks like the Bourbon's got a couple shows this weekend. So Friday night, they've got Back Pain in Black, and Saturday, the Damones. So get over to the Bourbon. I think you can get tickets online at thebourbon.com. There, we just laid out your whole weekend for you. You don't have anything else you need to do. Go support live. Go support local. Also, support KZUM. I do want to say, after being at the station seeing how hard they work when I was on the Metal Manifesto show, it was fantastic, and they work hard at it, and they do a great service. So support KZUM if you're listening to the radio out there. And now let's talk about some of our sponsors. First off, we have American Senior Benefits. Get a hold of Jason DeGosh, ask for him, and he will hook you up with all of the things that you're going to need. Next, Roots Music Shop. I mean, what else do we have to say about that? We've been talking about them forever, and I will never stop talking about them. Go to Roots Music Shop. Talk to Ryan. Ryan will get you set up with a new guitar, keyboard, drums, whatever it is. Go to Roots Music Shop. Sly Ink Tattoo. Bryce is the best in town. He's not only a personal friend of mine, but he's also a favorite of mine. He is the artist on some of my tattoos. He's fantastic. So go over there, get yourself an appointment. I know you got that tax money, so quit hiding it. Go get a tattoo. Then last but not least, we have Backtrack Records. This weekend, everybody, is Saturday, Record Store Day. Get over to Backtrack Records. Go get those special records that they always do for Record Store Day, the different colors and all the cool releases. I think that my favorite one that I'm going to personally pick up is the Post Malone performance that he did of all those Nirvana songs. So get over to Backtrack Records. Now let's get back to our guest, Harry Dingman. I mean, Echelons was an epic album, and you guys, I mean, you just continually got better and better as the albums went on. But tell us about with that. You don't need to, not to get into the negative, but tell me what happened when you went into that fourth album and you decided to leave the band.
Yeah, well, so there's a album that's basically not released. And that's before Echelons. That's like when we were doing more of a picking sound and more like chords, and we didn't have the heavier sound. So that's called the 14-song cassette LP. Then there was Echelons. And then we stopped recording Echelons because we're kind of out of money and didn't know what to do. And that's when IPR came in, and we worked on a 4-track. And those were, at Jeff's house, those were all the songs that came out on In the Marshes. And then we were signed when we did December, and we bought our own. Randy Watson, our sound man, bought an 8-track, and we recorded it at a bomb shelter. And we went on tour. We played a show in Omaha, and Greg just said, "I'm not dealing with Jeff anymore." He complained, just a bunch of stuff, it was like a lot was going on. We weren't getting along. So during the recording of December, we had a contract, so we had to make that album. And we were at this bomb shelter with Randy, and we did the basic tracks. Then we never talked to Jeff. Like, he did his thing, and I did my guitar thing with Greg and Randy. And then we got together once that we had the CDs and records in our hand. we didn't even talk. So just kind of, we just kind of drifted apart. And I know Jeff formed a different band called Stall Version, and Randy and Greg formed a band called The Return. And that was it. And I thought, okay, now, time to sell the guitar again. So, move on and do something different. And so then I called Jeff and I said, I really miss playing with you. And he said, well, I have this band Stall Version. Why don't you come in and practice? And I did. And my guitar playing fit in right away. So we had a gig at Duffy's. We played that show. And at that time, Jeff said, well, let's call it Four Against. I put that on the flyers. And I wasn't really happy about that, but I didn't really say anything because we had the show to play. And I remember thinking at that show, Jeff was Jeff. And I just thought it's time to move on. I don't, I've already done Four Against. I don't want to do this anymore. And so shortly after that, I just said, I'm not into, continuing, especially if this is called Four Against, because I considered Four Against the first albums. And, that's something that we even created before Jeff was even in the band. Actually, Greg came up with the name. So we were like, this isn't Four Against. And then at that show at Duffy's, Marty Amsler came up to me of New Brass Guns, and he said, hey, do you have any little brothers that play guitar? And I said, yeah. And I go, but he's not a very good guitar player. And then Marty was like, well, I really like your playing. And I said, well, this is my last show. I'm not playing with Jeff anymore. And he said, well, let's get together. So that Sunday we got together and started writing songs. And I said, do you think we could get Lori to sing? And he was like, sure, I'll get her over here. And then Lori started singing, but she was like, I can't sing to this, and I don't know what you guys are doing. So we kind of worked with her and tailored our songs to her voice, and that was the beginning of the Millions. But it was originally just Lori, myself, and Marty. Then Greg started to come over, and he brought like a hi-hat and maybe a tambourine and playing with us and at Marty's house. And then at a certain point he was like, well, this is what I want to do full time, so let's focus on the Millions. So that's how all that happened.
So that's how the Millions kind of became. And we're definitely going to, I do have to say, as I've been in a lot of bands and a lot of bands that went sour quick. So
yeah, it's kind of the nature of bands. I mean, it's hard to get people aligned with your musical taste. And, you have that chemistry, but then can you get along when you're on tour or, just dealing with things, just everyday bullshit things. And I think that's where Four Against really would shine, because Jeff and I didn't have to communicate. We just almost had an intuition when we played. I kind of knew what he was going to do, and he knew what, and that always wasn't the case. But a lot of times when we were focused in that early days of that loud room, we'd practice almost every day, and we'd just practice for like 30, 40 minutes and then come back the next day. It was a short, concentrated practice. So we'd get a lot done and just learn how to work together. So
it wasn't like people were being unprofessional. You guys were the utmost professionals, where my experience was different. I would get into these things and it would be like, I wanted to be as professional as possible, but some of these guys would be like a complete joke, right? And I mean, for me, I'm an anxiety mess, so I'm like a goose, crapping all over on the 4th of July just to get. And then they act a fool. I mean, I can remember having a drummer mid-show, he had to go to the bathroom. I mean, mid-set, and this guy gets up from his set and disappears. So the
right.
fall off, and then he comes back and he starts dancing with chicks, and he's like grabbing them and rubbing, and like getting like inappropriate with them.
We never had that problem. We had some instances where at the Knights of Pythias, it was a big show and there were lots of people there. And we set it up, and it was one of the first Four Against shows. And again, we're pretty nervous because, we were used to a big band with John Finbu out front, Liz on bass. And we start playing and the drums just stop. And I'm like, what's going on? I turn around and Greg's nowhere to be seen. Well, he had fallen off the drum riser and he fell backwards and hit his head. And he was delirious, but then he, just got himself together and started playing and finished the show. And he's like, I think I got to go home. And I think he got a concussion. Like we later went to the hospital, but he finished the show.
Oh, baby, rock and roll.
Yeah, yeah.
I had a drummer. He liked to tie one on during the show.
Oh, yeah.
How he did it, I'll never know. But yeah, but usually between sets 2 and 3, he would really start pounding. So I would always keep that break short so we could keep him on track. And I remember playing a show at the Nowhere Bar, and my drummer just stands up between songs and just starts attacking me. And I'm like, where is this even coming from, dude?
Right. Yeah, it's not fun. That's the whole thing, people are people. So
That ended that band. I mean, I just forked the whole thing. But yeah,
right.
we all have those stories. But
Yeah.
Let's move on to the Millions, because I don't think this is an oversight to say that, you were very successful in For Against, but when you moved over, I would even argue that the Millions, surpassed For Against in a lot of ways, with your success and everything else. But the Millions was just an epic band. Tell us a little bit more about your experience with the Millions.
Well, we did an early show with Caterwaul, this band from California, or Phoenix, I think. And they said, here's our manager's number. Call her. So we called Tammy up, and she started managing us. And right away, she started getting us deals, publishing deals or record deals. And we didn't take any of those. And also at that time, we knew like the best clubs to play because For Against to play them. So we started to play the Metro in Chicago, the Bottleneck in Lawrence, and just different venues, opening for people, talking to people. And then pretty soon we're getting like people from Virgin Records or Geffen flying in to see us play. And we thought, well, Marty was going to play in the band for 6 months and then get on with his life. But he said, I'll give it more time. This is interesting what's happening. And, we had set a goal. We were like, at that time, we were like, let's get a deal. Let's see where we can go with this. So that's kind of what we set our sights on. And then we signed with this company out of Chicago called Smash. I think James Brown and a lot of people from the 60s were on Smash. They kind of resurrected the label, and they were sponsored by Polygram and Island Records. So Chris Blackwell was part of that. He started Island Records. And so then all of a sudden, we're have a bigger booking agent and starting to do bigger tours and be able to record in different studios in Canada and Chicago and things like that. So it became more of a full-time thing. We still sometimes would come back and, take some time off, but it was pretty consistent that we're, on the road, recording, flying someplace, doing something with the band. So,
well, you guys toured with a lot of different people. So when I was looking at the Wikipedia for it, you guys had toured with Joan Jett, right?
You're right. A couple of times we played with Joan Jett. That was interesting. She was not that interested in us, and it seemed really, she was great, great musician. They put on a good show. A lot of people came to that show. And I remember thinking, after the show, I'll go and talk to her, but she wasn't around. So her guitar was sitting there, that famous like white Melody Maker. So I just started playing it. And I was like, I better stop, because if she sees me doing that, she looked pretty tough. Let's put it that way. And we played with like House of Love. We played with Sheryl Crow. Sheryl Crow was really nice. She's from the Midwest. And so, a couple dates into that tour, they were like, here, you guys just use our equipment. We don't have to set up everything twice. So let's have you use our equipment. And I know in Berlin, we got like 3 encores, and Sheryl Crow was like, yeah, that's great. Just do it quick and get off stage. But she was cool to let an opening band do the encores. So, at that time, things were going really well. We were kind of on fire, and it was a lot of fun because it was like a full-time thing, playing Europe and playing all these historic clubs and stuff. So, and venues. Audiences were a lot bigger and stuff like that. So, and at that time we were also signed to Polygram over in Europe. So that worked out pretty well.
Man, that's awesome. That's just a great history of what you guys have done. And how about what are you guys up to today? Or are you doing anything right now?
Yeah, I play with a band called Tolerating Bob, and Bob Meyer is the bass player of that band. And then Bruce Steven, I mentioned his name before. He was the drummer of the Cartoon Pupils and a lot of Lincoln bands like the Gladstones and Playground. And I played with him back in high school. And then we started playing together in the early 2000s. I had lived in Colorado for a while and then moved back about 2004. And that's when Four Against got back together. I got back together with Jeff and Paul Englehart, and we wrote a couple albums together and did some touring. And then after that ended, then I got together with Bruce and formed another band, and that morphed into Tolerating Bob, and we have Paul Rankin on vocals. So, we write our own songs, and we're playing at the Zoo Bar coming up here on the 17th. It's a Thursday night from 6 to 9, and that will be with some of my students will join us with that band. Like one of my students will be singing with us that night, and then we have some like 12-year-old band will play and 15-year-old. So that's what I've been into.
Any talk of like a millions one-off,
No, I don't think so at this time, unless, maybe me, you, and Marty will get together and play, and you can sing, Rich.
That was a dream come true, Harry.
Yeah, Rich came over and played with Marty and I, and that was fun. I'd like to do that again, so let's do it.
Absolutely, man. And I can drum and sing a little bit, so we can definitely make that happen. I was telling these guys before we went live how back in the day when I used to come to your shows, there was kind of this fourth wall with the bands back then. You didn't talk to the musicians, it was like, oh, they're gods. And I sort of had you guys on those pedestals, and then to come full circle to get that text that day, hey, Marty's coming over and I need a drummer, and I couldn't get in the car fast enough. And man,
it was great. We had and I think the things we jammed on were awesome.
Well, listen, it's that time of the show where you have to answer 10 questions for me, rapid fire. Richie's rapid.
Okay.
And
okay.
I'm
not that fast, so be prepared.
I'm going to give you two choices, and there's no deviation, okay?
Okay.
All right. You've entered into the contract here. So,
yeah.
Beatles or Stones?
Beatles.
In the 90s, Omaha or Lincoln better scene?
Don't know. Two different scenes.
That's not the choice, Harry.
Don't know.
Sheryl Crow or Joan Jett?
Don't know. Different.
Oh, my Lord. You're going to do this to all of them. Acoustic or electric?
Electric. That's easy.
All right. Here's a softball. Dogs or cats?
Dogs.
Chuck Taylor's or Burke's?
Chuck Taylor's.
Now, this one gets a little personal. New Order or Joy Division?
New Order.
Rice. Van Halen in the Van Halen days, just because you're a guitar player.
Mm-hmm.
Sammy or Dave?
Dave.
Nice. A tube amp or digital?
Tube.
Fender versus Gibson?
They're both great. I love them both. They're so different.
Fair enough.
If I had to choose, Rich, Gibson.
Very nice. Okay. Thank you for your time.
Oh, yeah.
Well,
great.
Harry, I just want to say thanks so much for giving us your time today and, sharing some history here of, Lincoln music in the scene. And again, just really appreciate you coming on Scratch the Vinyl today.
Oh, yeah. I appreciate you having me on. It was great. So.
Well, we've appreciated this time so much, Harry. We're just so glad to get someone of your caliber on here. Who you're a hero of ours.
Oh, thanks.
And we're just so glad to introduce you to our audience. And we look forward to hopefully talking to you again sometime.
Oh, yeah. Thanks for having me on. It's a pleasure to do that. So, and if you ever want to talk to any of the other band members, I can hook you up. So.
Yeah, Harry, thanks. I'm grateful for the inspiration over the years and just the great friendship and the joy. Joy you bring to my family members, as you know. And
right.
I listen to my wife every night, how Harry's challenging her on this.
Yeah. She's doing great. That rhythm is coming.
You know,
She'll be dangerous, like you
driving
said.
it into her head. You just gotta feel it and
Right. Awesome. Don't think.
let it fly. So, yes, thank
That's
you
awesome.
for everything over the year.
Oh yeah. Thank you guys.
All right, well, big thanks to Richard for coming in and filling in for Brooke, who's doing big things out the community, I'm sure. Randy, it's always great having you. You're a brother of mine. Harry, thank you for being on the show. And for the millions of listeners out there, we appreciate you guys so much. And we want you to tune in next week for another awesome episode of
Scratch the vinyl.